When you first install the Moza Pithouse software, this is what you are greeted with. You have the steering wheel, the base and the pedals, and then this game launcher on the side. If you don't see your games in this launcher, then simply scroll down, find the game, and then click on configure. But now let's move on to the more advanced settings. Let's go here, and then we have all our force feedback settings. First of all, we have the preset modes here, which are pretty good, but I would recommend still tuning all the presets to your liking, which I'm going to show you how to do. So first of all, the maximum steering angle. Either keep this all the way at the max and then limit the steering angle in the actual games you're playing, or simply click one of these options: hypercar, sports, standard car, and so on. How you change the steering angle depends on what kind of cars you're driving and what kind of games you're going to be playing. Next up is road sensitivity, which is how sensitive the wheel is to textures in the road and bumps especially. If you put this too high, the wheel is going to shake too much, and if you put it too low, it's going to feel disconnected from the car. I would recommend leaving this at the normal setting, which is 4. Next up, game force feedback intensity. Depending on what wheelbase you're using, this is going to change a lot. If you're using some of the higher powered wheelbases from Moza, such as the R16 or R21, it would probably be best to leave this pretty low down. Although if you're using a lower powered wheelbase, such as the Moza R5 or even R9, which is pretty powerful, you might want to keep this at 100% just so you can make sure you're using all the potential of your base. Next up, maximum wheel speed. Now it does say that a lower return speed is safer because the wheel won't spin as violently, but for drifting and for some situations you might want to keep this pretty high. I keep it at 100. Anywhere above that is simply unnecessary. Probably don't keep it too high, otherwise the wheel will spin unrealistically fast. Next up, wheel spring strength. So a lot of people make the mistake of putting this up high, although you should really keep this at 0 because this is only meant for games which don't support force feedback, although every modern racing game does. So keep this at 0, you won't need the setting at all. Next up is the wheel damper. You have a big explanation up here, but to explain it simply, it is basically smoothing out and dampening the force feedback, especially at higher speeds. So I've messed around with this quite a lot and I found that 20, 25 or even 30% is pretty good. Although if your wheel is oscillating at high speeds, rotating violently and uncontrollably, probably keep this a bit higher. Now moving on to the advanced settings, we have force feedback reversal, which you probably shouldn't use because most games have the force feedback tuned in correctly. Although if for some reason you're feeling like the force feedback is feeling very strange, it's not feeling realistic, it's not feeling good at all, it might be because the force feedback in the game is inverted, so simply check this if that is a problem. Now the maximum output torque limit really depends on how strong you want the wheel to feel, especially at the peak. If you set this to 50, the wheel will never go above 50% force feedback. This could be good, especially if you have young kids on the wheel and you don't want the force feedback to be too strong for them. Although once again, to get the full range of force feedback, I would still recommend leaving this at 100%, except if you have the higher powered wheelbases from Moza, in which case you might want to bring that down. Now, hands-off protection could be a pretty good feature. It basically stops the force feedback when it detects that your hands are not on the wheel. There's no weight on the wheel, so it's not gonna rotate or oscillate as violently. Next up, natural inertia. I keep this at 100% because anything above that seems too heavy and too unrealistic, especially if you're driving a car with power steering. And what this basically does is just make your wheel feel heavier and make more friction, which is also what this setting below it does, wheel friction. I keep this at 25 because I found that is the sweet spot. If you put it too low, the wheel will just feel too loose and too easy to rotate. Although if you put this too high, it's gonna feel like every car you drive has no power steering. Now these two settings down here, the speed dependent dampening, I recommend keeping these both at 0 because most modern racing games have this kind of setting implemented in the game and you don't need to do it through the software. This is what you get by default when you set the road sensitivity to 4, although you can change this, and this is the vibration and the frequencies of the force feedback. Up here you will get hints of what kind of effects you will feel at these frequencies, and if you're for example feeling like the curb effect seems too strong, simply bring this down, or if you feel like the ABS vibration is too weak, simply bring this up. Now the force feedback curve, I don't really know why you would use this. I would usually keep it at linear because anything other than that just kind of changes the force feedback. If you're having some issues with the feedback, then maybe mess around with these, but I would usually recommend keeping this at linear. As for the miscellaneous settings, you have the base status indicator, which is simply a small light on the wheelbase. What does matter is the soft limit stiffness. If you keep this at 1, it's gonna feel very soft when you you hit the wheel's rotation limit. Although if you put this all the way up to 10, it's gonna feel as if there's actually a mechanical bump there. It's gonna be very heavy and very strong. I keep this around 1 or 2 because that just makes it smoother and softer. Now soft limit strength is basically the same thing, soft, in the middle, or hard, and this depends on your wheelbase, how much force feedback it's gonna input when you reach the soft limit. Soft limit game force strength, I never understood what the setting did, but I just keep it on by default. Finally, the temperature control strategy. This option keeps the wheelbase up to 50 degrees Celsius, and this one keeps it up to 60. You can read these descriptions up here, but this is all personal preference, and I usually just keep this at this setting right here. Now, moving on to the actual wheel settings, you have the dual clutch pedals. You can choose between access combine, which means that both pedals will be pressed down at the same time, even if you only press one of them. Access split, which means they will be interpreted as separate pedals, or button, which means that the pedals on the bottom will simply be buttons, which you can program to anything in your game. This stick mode, just keep this at button. The engine RPM indicator, if you turn this on, you will see the RPM indicator LED lights on the wheel, although I usually have this off because I still haven't figured out a way to get them to work in BeamNG. And if you scroll all the way down, you can customize the brightness of the LED lights on your wheel. Now, if you have Moza pedals as well, then the configurations for those will be here, although I don't currently have those. Same thing with the display, the universal hub, the shifter, the sequential shifter, and the handbrake. And finally, this setting down here is where you can check if all your firmware is up to date. Simply check for updates here and then see if it's on the latest version. And if you go down here, you see your system settings. You can enable dark mode if you prefer. You can also check for updates in the software here. Now, the recovery and reset is pretty important if you're having any kind of issues with the wheelbase. If you are, then try and do this wheelbase recovery and reset, which might solve the problems. Finally, the experimental function is simply going back to software. If, for example, a software update came out and it turned out to be buggy or it doesn't work properly, then you can simply go back to the last software and you're all good. And this base Forza Horizon compatibility, turn this on if you play Forza Horizon.